Well, one of the things that may help explain this a little bit is when we start to think about substrate utilization. So substrate utilization just really reflects to us whether we're using the notion of using things like carbohydrates and fats. So what you can see is we can see the data from a group of athletes, and you can see, as one would expect, this kind of crossover based effect, that at the onset of exercise, the predominance of the substrate is coming from carbohydrate at the onset of exercise, and we've got a lower proportion coming from fats. Now this is prolonged kind of steady state exercise, so as one would expect to see, as they start to kind of get into this prolonged exercise, we start to get, particularly if it's a lower intensity, we start to get a down regulation in carbohydrate metabolism and an up regulation in fat-based metabolism, as one would expect to see in a spinal cord injured athlete. So in terms of kind of substrate utilization, there doesn't appear to be a significant impact when we look at spinal cord lesion almost globally. So that explanation in terms of what you're seeing here almost certainly doesn't come from just the ability to provide energy from the substrates, because this is kind of a standard response, and we see this whether they're a T51 or a T54. We see this pretty much across all of the classifications in terms of the spinal cord injury. So let's go a little bit further and again look at some data here, which is from Todd Astorino's group. And what we can see here is we've got our time minutes. This is from kind of the same data set. And what he's got here is the substrate contribution to total energy expenditure. And not surprisingly, here you can see your carbohydrates, their total contribution is greater than the total contribution that is coming from fats over this 35-minute block of exercise, okay? But when we then look at the rate of substrate oxidation, so what they've got here is the energy. So you can see the amount of energy coming, this is from carbohydrate, this is the amount of energy coming from fat-based metabolism. Again, as one would expect to see over a relatively long period of exercise. And in fact, as one would expect to see, significant differences have been observed. But where the data gets more interesting is when we then separate these out in the same data set for those that have got thoracic and a cervical. Remember, cervical is a higher lesion on the spinal cord. And here what they've got is the RER. So the RER, remember, is our respiratory exchange ratio, and it's our indication of whether we're predominantly burning fats or carbohydrates. So from about 0.75 to about 1, you're predominantly burning fats. Anything above 1, you're predominantly burning carbohydrates. But notice what you can see. If you look in the thoracic athletes, there's a bit of variability going on, but predominantly, for the majority of this exercise, they're fluctuating between about 0.85 and 0.95. So although it looks like there's big fluctuations, there isn't actually much of a change. But if you look at the cervical athletes, there is a progressive increase in energy being derived from carbohydrates. Whereas in the thoracic athletes, really, although there is the more variability in the data, you can put pretty much a plumb line through this data and say actually there's very little shift in terms of where the energy is coming from. Now that's quite important because it kind of alludes to the fact that spinal cord lesion height has some degree of impact on substrate availability. And what are the ramifications of that in terms of the oxygen cost of exercise? So if we look at the same data set, thoracic, cervical, look at the oxygen cost difference. The lower intensity of exercise, the onset of exercise, the first 15 to 20 minutes, those that have got a cervical lesion have got a lower oxygen cost of exercise compared to those that have got a thoracic lesion. So you might have to think, well, why is that the case? Why is that? Why is there such a difference? Well, there's a very simple answer, of course. Fundamentally, this is about active muscle mass. The higher the lesion is on the spinal cord, the less active muscle mass that they have. So it's not just about arms. Fundamentally, it's all the other muscles that are being used. As I move further up the spinal column in terms of the height of the injury, I start to lose things like postural control. I start to lose kind of control in terms of the core muscles. So somebody who's got thoracic spinal cord lesion will have the postural control, but because they've got it, it comes at an energy cost. You've got to perfuse those muscles, you've got to supply them with oxygen, so the oxygen cost goes up compared to the individual who hasn't got that, lumbar control. So this isn't a kind of performance metric, it's quite a simple indication of the totality of oxygen being used as a function of the totality of the muscle mass that is actually actively engaged in the exercise.